Oh, such a cooperative group. Well, it is a great pleasure for me to introduce our two lunch speakers today. And they have something new for us. And it literally is new because this is they will be presenting data from a 10-country survey of Pentecostals that was just completed. Luis, when was in the field? In July and August?
As late as September.
As late as September. They're searching far and wide to get good representation of Pentecostals in 10 countries. Now, as you'll see very soon, there are many of the countries they were surveying, they didn't have to look hard. In fact, everywhere they looked, they were finding Pentecostals and Charismatics and Renewalists. And I'm not going to explain those terms because Luis and John Green will explain a little more. But, you know, some people say there's nothing new under the sun, but I think you will see from some of their findings here that there's some very new things that are going on, some remarkable trends in the Pentecostal and Charismatic movements. And I want to make sure that we allow time, one, for our presenters to go over their survey data, and then second, for lots of Q&A. So with that, I'm very happy to turn over the microphone to Luis Lugo and then to John Green.
Nice effects. Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be with you to release the findings of this survey at a Templeton-sponsored symposium because it gives us, among other things, an opportunity to express our deep appreciation for the generosity of the Templeton Foundation in collaborating with us in bringing this very massive undertaking into the field, and now we'll see some of the results of that. So my deep appreciation. The rollout began yesterday with a audio conference with over 20 journalists, and a lot more than that have shown interest in the story. I frankly thought that it would take a bit longer to get this thing really rolling, but our communications people informed me that over 110 separate news organizations have already run stories on the findings. So clearly there's a lot of interest out there, more so, frankly, than I anticipated. Well, time is limited, so I'll forego all the jokes. There are some very good Fidel Castro jokes at the pearly gates. But actually, even if I had time, I wouldn't tell many jokes. I would never want to follow up Peter Berger when it comes to humor. I'm not a sociologist, I'm a political scientist, so I can't judge how good a religious sociologist Peter Berger is. But I do know that he is the jokemeister, without any question. A remarkable assortment of jokes for every nationality. I don't know how such a gift could come to reside in an Austrian, but that's something we can talk about later. Very quickly, let me tell you the basic contours of this survey. It's actually 10 different surveys, 10 different countries. The United States, and then 3 countries each in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Brazil, Chile, and Guatemala, Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa, Philippines, South Korea, and a local survey within 3 states in India. These are states with significant Christian populations. Except for the U.S., all of these surveys were face-to-face. It's the only way you can get a very statistically valid survey. They were conducted between May and September, with the average field period being about 4 weeks. So in some of these countries, mid-May to mid-June. In some other countries, we had to go back. And we continued out in the field until we had what we wanted, which was early September. This was, again, I should mention, 18 years of age and older, an adult survey. The samples were selected differently from country to country. In 6 of the countries, these were national samples. In 3 of them, Brazil, South Africa, In South Korea, they were predominantly urban. And as I mentioned, in India, it was local survey. These were 3 districts. These were districts within these 3 states that have particularly large Christian populations. So we do not make any claims about incidence rates for India as a whole, never mind these 3 states. It's simply about those districts. That's where the statistical sampling was really focused. We had an average of around 750 respondents from the general population, and all those numbers will have a margin of error plus or minus 3-4 percentage points. And then, of course, because we wanted enough Pentecostals and Charismatics to make useful comparisons, we took the ones we found in the general population survey, but then we stayed in the field interviewing and oversampling until we had an average of 624 respondents per country in the Pentecostal and Charismatic categories. Now, again, the margin of error there will shift 4 to 9%, depending on what the subgroup that we're talking about. Obviously, these were a consistent battery of questions, duly translated, of course, for the local context. Questions about religion, religious practices and beliefs, social and political attitudes, and then a battery of standard demographic questions, which we have still to mine. Obviously, this is immense data, and we wanted to take a good first cut, but we'll obviously want to go back and look at socioeconomic variables and match those up, et cetera. So there's a lot of more good stuff to come. I want to make a couple of comments on the estimated size of renewalist populations, and I will confess up front that I was quite skeptical of some of the numbers that have been thrown around on the number of Pentecostals and Charismatics. I guess it's an occupational hazard of hanging around reporters all the time in Washington, but I really needed to see it. And to be honest with you, I personally was surprised with some of these findings. Now, a quick explanation in the categories here. Throughout the report, we use the term Pentecostals to refer to people who identify as being part of Pentecostal churches, either classical Pentecostal denominations like the Assemblies of God, or the newer neo-Pentecostal or neo-charismatic denominations such as El Shaddai. Both of those groups are included under Pentecostals. Charismatics, we include under that label everyone who said they had Pentecostal beliefs and practices, but who were members of non-Pentecostal denominations. So in Latin America, the predominant religious identity of most of these folks will be Roman Catholic. But this will also include Protestants who are, let's say, in Baptist churches, but who consider themselves charismatic, Pentecostal. And then we use this umbrella term, which we're not quite pleased with. We just didn't know what else to use to keep the report from being so repetitive. It's an umbrella term, which we call renewalist, that includes both Pentecostals and Charismatics. Many times in the survey, when you read it, you will see that there's not much difference between Pentecostals and Charismatics. Other times there are important differences. So when the differences are not that great, we speak about renewalists. When we want to emphasize the differences, of course, we parse this out. We are open to suggestions, by the way, on the term renewalist. If you can come up with a better umbrella term, we'll welcome it. I should say a better term that communicates to journalists, government officials, and others of our target audiences, not necessarily academic terms. But I should emphasize that the term renewalist never appears in the survey itself. It's simply an umbrella term that we use in writing the report. Well, you see here that we can now pose the question, as I put it to the reporters and I've been quoted on. I think that we can now seriously ask the question whether Christianity in the developing world of Africa, Latin America, and Asia is well on its way to becoming Pentecostalized. I think these numbers really jump out. Not only the extent to which Pentecostal churches and neo-Pentecostal churches are growing, but I guess my biggest surprise was the extent to which Pentecostal beliefs and practices are impacting Christians in non-Pentecostal churches. what we call the charismatics. In several of these countries, that grouping is even, much larger than the number of Pentecostals. So these are Catholics who, in Latin America, who are adopting Pentecostal beliefs and practices, but are staying within the Roman Catholic Church. A very, very interesting phenomenon. As you can see, particularly in Latin America, which is the most Pentecostalized region of the countries that we studied, you have countries like Guatemala, which is now majority charismatic and Pentecostal, majority renewalists, 6 out of 10 Guatemalans. Kenya in Africa, 56%. And Kenya had the single largest percentage of Pentecostal at 33. So remarkable, really. By the way, we don't report the figures here, but if you look at our demographic analysis, we include an appendix with a religious demographic analysis for each of these countries that draws upon the survey, but also other data such as the census. And if our figures are right, Guatemala is no longer majority Catholic. In the demographic and health survey that the Guatemala Census Bureau took in 99 had Catholics at 52.6%. Our numbers indicate that they were at 48%. So, that's a fairly significant development. Protestants now stand at 34% of the country. And also a significant number of unaffiliated, about 15%, which I thought that was quite interesting in Latin America compared to Africa, for instance. You have a significant number of people who are unaffiliated. We might call them seculars in this country. And in fact, those numbers are not unlike what we find in our polling here for people who are unaffiliated or secular, as we call them. Even more pronounced, of course, is the impact of Pentecostalism within Protestantism in the global South. In places like Brazil, Chile, and Guatemala, we're talking roughly 8 out of 10 Protestants, or evangelicals as they're called throughout the region, who are Pentecostals, who either belong to Pentecostal or Neo-Pentecostal churches, or who are maybe Presbyterians or Baptists or whatever, but practice the gifts of the Spirit. I mean, this is remarkable. 85% of Guatemalan Protestants, again, who are a growing force within Guatemala. We do a time analysis in the demographic appendix. But also in other countries such as Kenya and Nigeria and the Philippines, huge numbers of renewalists as part of the church. It's really quite striking. Won't surprise you that we found that there are some very distinctive Pentecostal practices throughout the world. What may surprise you is how really distinctive they are. We asked the questions about manifestations of the signs of the Spirit in worship services, speaking in tongues, divine healing, prophesying, holy laughter, etc. And these are the results that came back. Pentecostal churches have some very distinctive elements to them. By the way, the numbers we show here was for those who said frequently or always in their worship services. They see those signs, frequently or always. There was the third category down was occasionally. And you can add 20, 30, 40 points to this. All right? So, again, even among those who are not in churches that practice on a week-to-week basis Pentecostal practices, most of these Christians here who are not in those churches are still acquainted with it. I'm telling you, it's 20, 30, 40 points when you add, tack onto this, when you add the occasionally. This is a very similar pattern, by the way, that we find on these things from country to country, with those who are Pentecostals being at the high end, and then charismatics coming in somewhere in between other Christians and Pentecostals. I will not use the term Pentecostal light, and if there's any member of the press, I didn't use it. But I'm sure somebody will start talking in that way. And the numbers do indicate that. They share in many of the Pentecostal beliefs, but not to the same extent as classical Pentecostals or neo-Pentecostals. If there is one manifestation of the Spirit that characterizes Pentecostal more than all of them, is divine healing. Huge levels of belief here. Very, very strong. With, almost 80% in most of these countries of Pentecostals indicating this. And also a good number of charismatics. Perhaps, again, the most distinctive feature in holding Pentecostal communities together. One of the surprising findings in the survey is that we found the experience of speaking in tongues to be much less prevalent. In fact, in 6 of the 10 countries we surveyed, more than 40% of members of these communities said they never spoke in tongues. Never. Which is really, again, quite jolting. More than 40%